We know that it is a busy time for everybody, especially those of you who are in college or grad school. We know that it's midterms coming up, so we just really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I am Dr. Jake Newsome. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm logging on and joining this evening from sunny San Diego. I am the founder and director of the Pink Triangle Legacies Project, which is a grassroots initiative that honors the memory of the Nazis, queer and trans victims, and carries on their legacy by fighting against homophobia and transphobia today through education, empowerment, and advocacy. The Pink Triangle Legacies project team is proud to partner with OutVote to bring you this event this evening. And so with me tonight from OutVote is Joe Liu.
Hi, folks. My name is Joe. So I use they, them pronouns, and I'm currently logging on from New York City, New York. So if you're here in the, in the Northeast, give a little holler in the chat. I'm so excited that all of you are joining us tonight. And just to tell you a little bit about what OutVote does, we are a youth-founded, youth-led organization dedicating to get LGBTQIA+ folks to the polls. So obviously, if you're here, you might be just a little bit queer, but we want to make sure that you are getting out to the polls in the next upcoming few weeks with this monumental election headed up. And we're so excited to kind of share more with you as the evening progresses.
We are here this evening at a particularly vital time for LGBTQ communities, right? Across the world, we are witnessing an alarming rise and wave in anti-LGBTQ legislation. Here in the US, there have been over 520 anti-LGBTQ bills proposed at the state and federal level just in this year alone. So that's actually almost 2 bills per day, every day, for 7 days a week since January. And the rhetoric that politicians are using against queer and trans communities has really reached extremes that we haven't seen in decades. But you don't have to take our word for it. We've put together a little montage so that you can hear it straight from the source.
No reason anybody anywhere in America should be telling any child about transgenderism, homosexuality, any of that filth.
You don't need to be in the pew every Sunday to know that there's something wrong in this country when gays can serve openly in the military.
People who are trapped in the homosexual lifestyle, they're in constant rebellion with order, with their natural order.
When you're using a drag queen to recruit for the Navy, that's not the people we want. What we need is alpha males and alpha females who are going to rip out their own guts, eat them, and ask for seconds.
Then for the good of society, and especially for the good of the poor people who have fallen prey to this confusion, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. The whole preposterous ideology at every level.
When did our public schools, any schools, become what are essentially grooming centers for gender identity radicals?
Sure. Like maybe teach the kids to read before you tell them to go trans.
Disney wants to completely take your children and they want to indoctrinate them into sexual immoral filth.
Every single homosexual in our country should be charged with the crime, the abomination of homosexuality that they have. They should be convicted in a lawful trial. They should be sentenced with death. They should be lined up against the wall and shot in the back of the head. That's what God teaches.
Among the new laws signed, SB 254, which restricts gender-affirming care.
We never did this through all of human history until 2 weeks ago. Now this is something. They're having third graders declare pronouns. We're not doing the pronoun Olympics in Florida. It's not happening here.
But you've also said that saving girls' sports is the women's issue of our time. And we passed legislation to protect girls' sports for girls. We did that early, too, didn't we, legislators?
Let me tell you, I will continue to say best governor in the country.
I will keep men out of women's sports, okay? Who would even think that you could allow this? Who would say that this is okay? These people are sick. They're deranged. On day one, I will immediately sign a new executive order to cut federal funding for any school pushing critical race theory, transgender insanity, and other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children. It's amazing how strongly people feel about that. You see, I'm talking about cutting taxes, people go like that. Talk about transgender, everyone goes crazy. Who would have thought 5 years ago you didn't know what the hell it was?
Remarkable. A true statement from Donald Trump. Even the P.T. Barnum of our time can't believe how quickly this concocted culture war over trans rights has captivated the GOP base and how easy it is to now manipulate them with it.
So these words that we just heard and countless others from politicians and commentators are dangerous, right? Especially when these words are then turned into law. And today, this is not the first time that those in power have used the structures of power to oppress LGBTQ folks. And so this evening, together, we're going to look at one historical example that very clearly demonstrates the dangers of homophobia and transphobia being enshrined into law. And we'll also see how a lot of the rhetoric that the current right wing uses today echoes that was used by the Nazi regime in Germany. Now, our team of experts has identified 6 key lessons from the history of Nazi Germany, and we're going to walk through those together. And then our partners at OutVote will help tell us what we can do to act on those lessons and to build a democracy that protects the LGBTQ community. The first lesson is that progress is fragile and always needs to be constantly defended. So in the 30 years before the Nazis came to power, queer and trans Germans had built the most visible and dynamic LGBTQ community in the world up to that point. There was a vast network of queer publications. So whether you were interested in politics or art or sports or leisure, you could find a magazine or a newspaper or a pamphlet for you. And there was actually, and this really surprised me from the research, there was a combined readership of over 1 million people, right? Over 1 million people reading these queer and trans publications in Germany during the 1920s. In Berlin alone, there were over 100 nightclubs, bars, cafes, restaurants, and businesses for the LGBTQ community. Berlin during this period was also home to the very first LGBTQ rights organization in the world. It was led by a Jewish socialist and gay physician named Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. In 1919, he founded the Institute for Sexual Science, which was a pioneer in studying human sexuality, but especially in advancing transgender advocacy and healthcare. Hirschfeld's institute even worked with the Berlin Police Department to issue gender-affirming IDs to trans people to help shield them from discriminatory laws. And then the Nazis were elected to power. Right? So they became the largest political party in Germany in 1932. And then in January of 1933, Hitler was appointed the chancellor of the nation. And within weeks, not months, but within weeks, the Nazis drove these vibrant queer and trans communities back underground and ultimately initiated the most violent attack on LGBTQ folks in modern history. So again, progress is always fragile. It can be destroyed and pushed back and taken away. Our second lesson is that homophobia and transphobia have long been political strategies of right-wing extremists. So history shows us that anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and politics often frames LGBTQ communities as a fad or something new, right? Conservative politicians often point to the LGBTQ community as evidence of so-called moral decline, especially during times of social change. So what we see is that often verbal attacks on queer and trans people are framed in taking back the country or restoring traditional values. That was the case in Nazi Germany too. So in the 1920s and 1930s, and while Germany was still a democracy, there were multiple conservative parties all trying to win over the votes of voters and therefore have more authority in parliament. And all of these different parties had differing stances on the economy or geopolitics and cultural issues of the time. So the Nazis were very adept strategists, and they revved up their homophobic rhetoric because they knew that doing so would rile up their base, but also unify the right wing in a way that other issues might not. And as we'll see, it worked. Fanning the flames of homophobia and transphobia was a very strategic move on the Nazis' part to shore up voters, especially among Christian conservatives. Now, today's anti-LGBTQ stereotypes are dangerously similar to the ways that the Nazis talked about queer and trans people, and that is lesson number 3. Now, some of the arguments that the Nazis made at the time against LGBTQ folks were unique to that particular time and place. So, for example, much of Nazi ideology was based on the international eugenics movement. And so that meant that Nazi leadership believed that they could create a so-called master race through the better breeding of humans. So for the Nazis, understanding and then controlling human sexuality was a central part of their political enterprise. Sex, and I mean literally controlling who could have sex with whom, was seen as absolutely key to creating this so-called master race through procreation. In October of 1936, Heinrich Himmler, who was one of the most powerful men in the Nazi regime, established what was known as the Reich Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion. So for the Nazis, LGBTQ issues were clearly bound together with issues of reproductive rights. According to Nazi leadership, the threat or the alleged threat that homosexuality posed was really to the German birth rate. They argued that queer and trans people allegedly stole potential offspring or future children from the fatherland. So while these particular points were unique to Germany in the 1930s, in other aspects, the Nazis' anti-LGBTQ rhetoric is similar to the way that conservatives in other times and places have spoken about the LGBTQ community. So, for example, the Nazi leadership did not believe that people were born gay or trans. And they believed that it was a lifestyle choice and that people who were engaged in that lifestyle could be cured or forced to give up this vice through often extremely violent forms of what we today might call conversion therapy. So it was this belief that homosexuality was something that could tempt anybody and indeed everybody that made it so dangerous, according to the Nazis. They were afraid of more and more Germans turning gay. So in 1927, for example, this was 6 years before Hitler was appointed chancellor, Wilhelm Frick, who was a Nazi politician, stood on the floor of the German parliament and announced that unnatural fornication between men must be prosecuted with all severity, because if it was left unchecked, this vice would lead to the downfall of the German nation. Now, the main talking point that the Nazis fell back on time and time again was that queer people were pedophiles and were trying to, quote, seduce Germany's youth into the homosexual lifestyle. And they said this across the radio waves and published it across local and national newspapers. In 1936, the SS newspaper ran a front-page article stating that the threat of homosexuals to Germany's young people, especially to young boys, was so high that the party officially deemed to categorize them as enemies of the state. In the summer of 1934, Hitler wrote a memo telling his lieutenants that I want every mother to be able to send her son to the stormtroopers, to the party, and the Hitler Youth without fearing that he might be debased in his manners or morals. Stormtroopers should be leaders and not ludicrous apes. Now, lesson number 4 is that conservatives use vague and broad terminology to defend their anti-LGBTQ legislation. The same is true for the Nazis. Once they gained power in 1933, they immediately began turning their anti-LGBTQ rhetoric into anti-LGBTQ laws. But I want to point out that their laws weren't named, right? The laws against, laws against gay men, the laws against lesbians, for example. They mostly used vague and broad names for their legislation in an attempt, on the one hand, to build more support among voters, but on the other hand, to hide the law's true intentions. So, for example, within weeks of Hitler's appointment as chancellor, the party passed a series of policies that forcibly shut down any, quote, establishment that promoted immorality. So pretty broad, right? Leaving that up to them to how to interpret. So, of course, this meant that they used these policies to close down the vast network of LGBTQ meeting spaces, bars, community centers, and organizations. Now, the Nazis also knew how important it was to control people's access to information and to shape public narrative. So while they were spreading homophobic propaganda, they also took away the ability of LGBTQ folks to defend or write and advocate for themselves. But they did so by immediately banning all LGBTQ publications. This was literally one of the very first pieces of legislation that the Nazis passed when they came to power. Then we have May of 1933. A group of college students and Nazi stormtroopers looted the Institute for Sexual Science, which was that LGBTQ organization that we mentioned a few slides back. The students looted, raided, and burned over 20,000 books, unique artifacts, and research materials in the infamous book burnings in Berlin. So here, we actually have photographic evidence of the content of the world's very first LGBTQ archive going up in smoke and destroying the records of our history. By far, the biggest weapon in the Nazis' arsenal was a law called Paragraph 175. Now, this law criminalized so-called unnatural fornication between men, and I think it's important to note that it predated the Nazis. It had actually existed since the unification of Germany as a nation in 1871. But in 1935, the Nazis felt that the way that law was worded was too constricting. It constricted their ability to carry out what they wanted to against LGBTQ folks. So in 1935, the Nazi lawyers amended the law by broadening it. So you can see the verbiage of that new version here on your screen, and this new version criminalized so-called indecency between men. Now, this was left intentionally vague so that judges and prosecutors could interpret that how they wanted to on a case-by-case basis and convict as many men as possible. As a result, the number of arrests and convictions under Paragraph 175 skyrocketed after the Nazis amended it. Now, again, after this amendment, it's also easier for anyone to accuse someone of being gay and know that the regime will react to that accusation, whether it's true or not. So that leads us to the fifth lesson from the history. And that's that the Nazis' violence against LGBTQ folks was wildly popular among ordinary Germans. And I have to say, this is probably one of the most shocking things that I've found from the archives in my research, that the persecution of LGBTQ folks in Germany during the era of the Holocaust was not just a top-down persecution led solely by the government. Now, the majority of the German population did nothing to help LGBTQ folks. They also did nothing to question or resist the Nazis' violence against this community. But a significant portion of the citizenry went even further and actively participated in the persecution of LGBTQ folks. They knew that their voice could activate the power and the violence of the Nazi regime against anyone that they denounced, especially queer people. Now, we know from the archives that ordinary people turned in queer and trans folks into the Nazis in truly staggering numbers. Denunciations by neighbors, co-workers, landlords, strangers, acquaintances, and in some cases even family members played a defining role in the Nazi regime's ability to locate and then arrest LGBTQ people. We know from the records that 1/3 of all paragraph 175 convictions came from civilian denunciations. And in one case, the number of denunciations of queer people rose so dramatically that a local newspaper in Hamburg had to urge their readers to stop turning in gay people so they wouldn't overburden their police department until the police could catch up with their work. Here's the final lesson that we want to leave with folks this evening, is that democracy does not inherently protect LGBTQ rights. We talked a little bit about earlier how democracy collapsed in Germany in 1933 when people voted the Nazi Party into power. They understood that the Nazi Party was a homophobic party, was an anti-Semitic party, was a racist party, and yet still voted them into power. Now, the Allies, including the Americans, defeated Nazi Germany in May of 1945, and you might think that most queer and trans Germans hoped that the end of the war also meant the end of their persecution. But unfortunately, they were wrong. The American military upheld the Nazi version of paragraph 175 and even imprisoned gay concentration camp survivors during the occupation period. And when West Germany was created in 1949, again, this was America's democratic ally, West Germany also chose to uphold and use the Nazi version of paragraph 175. So this democratic government used a fascist law to arrest over 100,000 queer men. Paragraph 175 was finally amended in 1969, but it wasn't fully repealed until 1994. In the 1940s and 1950s, the US launched a massive attack on LGBTQ Americans. They purged thousands of LGBTQ folks from the federal government in what has now become known as the Lavender Scare. And after the hard-fought victories in the wake of Stonewall, LGBTQ Americans also faced extreme backlash during the Reagan years and the AIDS crisis. Up to this very day, the LGBTQ community has won some important victories, right? Like like marriage equality and more protections under the law. And yet this, as we are witnessing today, has sparked incredible backlash over the past decade. And Republicans' Project 2025 shows us in horrifying detail what conservatives want to do to queer and trans people if they are let back in the White House. So to me, one of the most powerful lessons of this is that democracy itself does not protect minority rights. We have to organize, educate ourselves, and work to fight for these protections. Now, Nazi history shows us just how far homophobia and transphobia have gone in the past, but it doesn't have to be like that. It's up to us to decide how far we're going to let it go today. So to help equip us for the fight against homophobia and transphobia today, I'd like to now turn it over to Joe Liu, who is the Director of Coalitions and Outreach at OutVote.
Thank you so much, Jake, for telling us all about that and sharing more information. So before we get started, I just want to gauge and see how everything is going. So first off, I want to see, can everyone send a number in the chat? So let's see. How many pieces of anti-LGBTQIA plus legislation do you think has been written and is now on the floor of multiple legislatures across the country? Can anyone give me a number? You can type it in the chat. Oh, don't look at that. That was the answer. 200 plus, 220. Okay, do we have any more numbers? If you cheated and you're typing the number that you saw, I'm gonna be really sad. Maria said 500. Okay, Maria, I'm gonna trust that you didn't cheat. I believe you, girl. Anyone else? Are we going with those numbers? Perfect. All right, well, let's move on. So, hate to break it to y'all, but this year alone, 530 pieces of anti-LGBTQIA plus legislature. Okay. Now let's just look at it in the last 2 years. In 2022, we had 278 pieces, with the majority of them targeting America's transgender youth. Now, thankfully, only of all of those pieces, only 20 passed and went into law, but 17 were targeting transgender students who are athletes at their institutions. In 2023, you see almost a 100% increase from the prior year, 520 pieces of legislation, and now we see 530 this year. Now, keep in mind, we are in October, right? So we've still got a little bit left of this year for people to start going out and saying what they want, writing legislation, and spewing hateful rhetoric. So we'll see if that number goes up, and let's hope that it doesn't. But it's kind of sad for people like me who are from the South to see that our culture and community of, preaching love for your neighbor and following what our families have taught us about loving one another, and seeing that one of our own southern states, Oklahoma, has had the most bills passed, or most bills put onto the floor of legislature out of the entire country. 55 out of one state. Okay. And this year, 44 bills have already passed into law, those including forced outing in school that requires teachers, faculty, and staff to out their students to their families, whether that be over their sexual orientation or their gender. We're also seeing curriculum censorship. I see this a lot in my home state of Texas. So I know that one person said that they're from Dallas, which I am as well. I have seen this a lot in my hometown, and with all of the rules that my school board has been making, seeing how they have removed things like critical race theory on top of already removing things that are teaching about LGBTQIA plus history, and contemporary education. And then last off, they're also trying to redefine what sex means. Obviously, they're targeting the definition of cisgender and really trying to ensure that cisgender pulls straight into your sexual identity, sexual orientation, and forgetting the fact that there are intersex people as well. And so there's a lot of information that is really just being stirred around to ensure that queer people are being targeted and erased from our society. So just since 2020, right? Just because these last 4 years have been a ride in of themselves. We don't even need to address the entire Trump administration and the Trump era. We've got all of these bills that I've laid out in front of you, right? You hear about the Florida House Bill 1557 that was put out in 2022, aka the Don't Say Gay bill. That has been really impactful for a lot of students, and fighting and seeing them advocate on their own needs has been really impactful. And I really encourage you to follow kind of that grassroots work that's happening in Florida, because those students have taken on the torch and have started to advocate for themselves and their communities, but also making sure that queer people aren't erased. Besides that, you have the Arkansas House Bill 1570 back in 2021, Save Adolescents from Experimentation. You have, once again, my home state, Texas State Bill 114 from 2023, that's banning gender affirming healthcare. You have the Montana House Bill 112 from 2021, banning transgender athletes. You have Florida again, Florida House Bill 1521 from 2023 on their bathroom bill, and Tennessee Senate Bill 2023, Senate Bill 3 from 2023, banning drag. So all of these things are really trying to go after core tenets of what it means to be a queer person here in America, whether that be you just simply existing, you simply trying to go wash your hands in the bathroom or use the bathroom in general, your freedom of expression, your freedom of speech, your access to healthcare. Every facet of LGBTQIA plus experience is being attacked and has been attacked for quite a long time, especially after the rise of the Trump administration. Besides that, who here has heard of Project 2025? I'm assuming that all of us have. Yeah. It's the very sad hand raise that we're seeing, that unfortunately we have heard about Project 2025 and what it is trying to target, when conservatives are saying that they are promoting traditional families and they want the nuclear family to remain a core tenet of what it means to be an American and American traditions and culture. That is very clearly marginalizing non-traditional families. It's putting queer people on the chopping block. It is putting families that maybe are, put together from different marriages or adoption, all on the chopping block. These people are people and they deserve to have this recognition as just a normal person. But Project 2025 very clearly is trying to marginalize anyone who is not cisgender, heterosexual, and can fit within the idea of a modern American family that subscribes to American ideals. Then, as I said before, anti-gender affirming healthcare. You're already seeing that there has been this mass repeal of gender affirming healthcare all across the country, and not just in the South. You're now seeing this kind of large wave of anti-gender affirming healthcare bans going on rampantly that are attacking people, trying to make sure that they can become the people that they feel that they are inside and have that reflected on the outside. We're also seeing this move into schools as well. So there's been a large targeting of teachers who discuss gender ideology. I know for me, from my hometown with our school board, I talked a lot with some of our elected members, and some of them were very much kind of people that I did not expect to be very staunch allies to the queer community, but they talked heavily about protecting teachers who are wanting to ensure that their students are safe and feeling that they are being represented and that they're not alone and that what they're going through isn't crazy. But at the same time, we have policy that is attacking these teachers, trying to label them as sex offenders, trying to get them removed from their jobs when we very clearly have a shortage of teachers all across this country. On top of that, we have things where where the government has been proposing that there be regulations that interpret sex as solely male or female, which is also what I said earlier about the entire thing of making sure that everyone subscribes to the cisgender kind of boundaries of gender, but at the same time forgetting that in sex there is also a wide spectrum that is not just male or female. There are intersex people, and there is variation in nature. And I think many conservatives forget that in reality, nothing is as clear as black and white, especially in nature and how we see things. These are very natural things, and to see that we are being forced into one box or another is highly problematic and takes away a lot of autonomy for many, many people who may not fit into those boxes. Besides that, there's also restricting of information about queer identities, specifically for children. So one part of Project 2025 that I personally was actually very surprised by when I was first going through it was the targeting of telecommunications companies who create anything about queer content. So whether that be educational, whether that be entertainment, Project 2025 very clearly wants to remove those companies and shut them down so they are no longer capable of creating any content, whether that be LGBTQIA plus focused or not. And so there is a very clear infringement on the First Amendment rights of people in that very sense of we are literally not getting the information that we need and deserve. And we are also not getting any of that communication from the outside where anyone could be talking about this information and getting it to other people. And then lastly, but also it's kind of the most plain and simple of Project 2025, that is going to be kind of the first thing on the chopping block, is the clear opposition of same-sex marriage. I mean, we saw that gay marriage was legalized under the Obama administration. I very clearly remember that day because that was the day that I decided to come out publicly because I felt safe for the first time as a queer American, especially a queer Asian American in the South. That was the first time I ever felt safe. And seeing that Project 2025 now wants to get rid of that very first thing that feels like we had some safe ground to stand on as queer people is incredibly dangerous. And by removing like the right to same-sex marriage, Project 2025 is also trying to highlight that they want to give organizations, specifically religious organizations, more kind of personal leeway to dedicate how they want to run their organizations. And in that language, essentially wanting to take away anyone's opportunity to get services or to be part of groups that they identify with if their leadership denies that they believe in the tenet of, human rights for queer people. And so Project 2025 greatly impacts all of us. And I don't just say this in the sense of it impacts us as queer people, it impacts people of color, it impacts every single tenet of our society. And I think that many people very clearly forget the danger that Project 2025 is inherently, as many of us don't get to subscribe to the cisgender, rich, white, heterosexual kind of narrative in this country. And we are a country of all different kinds of people who come from different backgrounds. And in order to protect all of us, we need to stand against Project 2025 and everything that it wants to take away from us. Now, I know that I said some very depressing things, and I'm so sorry that this is the reality that all of us have to live with. But at the same time, I hope that this motivates you very clearly to stand up and to stand up for something, whether that be for yourself as a queer person, or for your queer best friend or sibling, or for your queer parents or your queer family. Whoever it is, stand up. It's time to get going, and it's time to get out and vote. So in this election, I know that a lot of us are feeling quite frazzled. Let's just say that as a word. I know that I very much am feeling the same way. And so for me, especially after moving up to New York very recently, I was like, how do I get my life together? Now, let's walk you through this. First thing I did was, after I got here, I said, okay, we're going to pledge to vote. I was already going to vote in Texas. We're going to vote here in New York since I'm a citizen here now. So I was like, great. I made my voting plan, and I made sure that I had my voter registration all up to date for New York City. So you can make sure that you are going to different resources to check. We as OutVote actually have a collaboration with the Human Rights Campaign, which is super cool. But we have that collaboration called Pride to the Polls. So you can check out our link, and it'll give you access to all of our resources, including a voter registration check. You can sign up and pledge to vote. It'll also give you access to information about polling locations around you and making sure that everything is up to date and making sure that you are empowered to vote in just a couple of weeks, because the election is just a little under 4 weeks away, and that is both exciting and daunting. Lastly, make your voting plan. I was like, okay, I live in New York City, which means that I have public transit. How can I get to my polling location? Will it be quick? Will it be easy? In consideration to my schedule, what is that going to look like? Am I going to have to go to school? Thankfully, my university allows us to take the entire day off, and it's actually a whole thing for the whole school where all of us get to take the day off to go and vote. So make sure you're aware of these things and making your plan to vote, because showing up and doing that work, just checking off things on the ballot, is only a tiny, tiny step of this entire process. Make sure that you know how you're getting to these places and getting stuff done, because getting there is the entire battle, and putting your ballot down and submitting it is going to feel great, especially in this election. Next, if you've already got all of that under your belt and you are prepared and ready to go, get active. So OutVote has our ambassadors program, which our ambassadors are awesome people. Now, our ambassadors are all across the country. We've got folks all the way in LA, all the way up here to New York City. And so people who are ambassadors with OutVote are actually volunteers who are already doing this kind of mobilizing work in their communities, whether that be signing up and getting people registered to vote, or helping to host events that are promoting voting and, the different things that I had mentioned earlier, like the pledging to vote or making voting plans. There are so many ways that you can be active in your own community and acting as a pillar that help to bring other people to the polls as well. So if you want to become an OutVote ambassador, this is a really awesome program. And there's also ways for you to get paid as well, which is really nice, because I know in this economy, I personally would be like, I need some more money because I'm really broke. So I would say, if you are passionate, if you are just a little bit gay, and if you want to vote and you want to get people to vote, we are your people. We want to help you do your thing. So come and help us do our thing. That feels like a good trade-off. But finally, be brave and make your presence known. I know that in this time and space, it can feel so, so incredibly isolating to be queer and to be brave about it. There is so much to fear, and I'm not trying to be like, the world is so dark and scary and gloomy, but it is. And your concerns are incredibly valid. And I hope you know that you're not alone in that struggle. But at the same time, one brave person has the ability to spark impact among all of our peers. You standing up could mean the difference for someone shying away from who they are to being brave enough to admit that this is who they are and to be proud of it. And in this kind of time and day, we need that. We need that inspiration, we need that light, and we need that hope. So I'm asking you to be brave and to make yourself known into the communities that you're part of, because you are valuable. Your voice does matter, and your impact is greater than you'll ever know. And so, very last thing is that even though I've been mentioning this election so many times in the last couple of minutes that I've been speaking, the work does not end after election day, right? Just if we get, for example, if we got Kamala Harris into office, is that going to immediately fix all of our problems? Heck no, because God only knows that our elected officials can and will do so much. And I say this very confidently as part of a voting organization. Voting does work, but there is so much more space for you to do work elsewhere. You have the ability to make change and to shape your communities and to apply pressure in ways that maybe you did not anticipate that exist outside of voting. So stay committed to the cause and keep advocating, because your work, your voice, and your power is going to be your biggest strength. And we don't necessarily need to be relying on our elected officials all the time to get things done for us. We can rely on each other. Be that leader that you expect from someone else and make that change that you want to see, because I know that you have that power in you and that there is so much that you can do to help and contribute to our community that's going to make all of us better in the long run. So I really challenge you to stay active, to keep doing the work, whether that be with OutVote, because God knows that I would love to have you on our team, working with us even past this election, but also in your communities. I hope to see some of you leading your own organizations going forward and making that change alongside of us, because in the end, we are all queer people. We all feel the heat and the struggles and the presence of what is going on today. But at the same time, we are the only ones that can help dig ourselves out of this. And together, united, we have something to fight for. So I appreciate you guys listening. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe and Jake, for that incredible information. Hi, everyone. I'm Nic Suarez. And if you couldn't tell, as I was blowing up the chat with all of our incredible resources, I am currently an intern for the Pink Triangle Legacies Project. I'm joining us tonight from New York City as well. And I'm going to be moderating this evening's Q&A session. So we've already had an active chat. You guys have had no problem dropping questions there. But if anyone would like to unmute themselves, just raise your hand so we can do this in an orderly fashion. If you're not comfortable speaking out and you'd prefer to just have your question written, you can drop it in the chat and I'll be reading them out to Joe and Jake to answer your questions. So let's start it off. Anyone have a question they want to start off with?
I want to, while folks are maybe articulating their questions, I want to turn it around and actually ask the folks on the call maybe what was the most, either like one new thing that they learned from myself and Joe, or maybe one of the most striking or you think important lessons from this history.
I thought that one of the most striking things was how pointed the persecution of queer people within the Nazis was depicted. I just didn't realize there was that much detail out there. So I appreciate that. I also had a question about the ways that you can get involved in your respective organizations, and like what like I know myself, I often find like there's so many things, like I'm juggling like 1,000 different things, but there's so many things that like if I had like 5 minutes, like I would totally do X, or like I want to try to help as much as I physically can. But like what resources do you have to like help us help you guys? Does that make sense?
I can just speak to that real quickly. The PTL Project does have a number of different ways to get involved, and some of those are, several months long projects. We've got folks doing research to help us tell LGBTQ stories from Nazi Germany, but we also we know that folks are busy, don't have a lot of time, but still, as you said, still want to contribute. And one of those that we really are hoping to roll out either by the end of the month or into November is essentially like a PTL brand ambassador for folks who want to help us get the word out. We will be able to send you a link to our Google Drive where we keep all of like our branded posts and things that are, if you just want to be able to share something to your story that helps get this history out there, or that tells people, hey, go check out OutVote. How do you get involved with it, with them as one of our partners? If folks who are plugged into different communities and different different digital communities want to be able to share our content, we want to make that as easy as possible. So, if you want to follow or subscribe to our monthly newsletter, you'll be the first to know about when that, we're going to come up with a different name, but is essentially a brand ambassador program launches.
I just want to highlight what some folks are saying in the chat right now. Cormac said that it was illuminating to hear the actual amount of anti-queer legislation being raised currently. Definitely was for me too. I'm from Florida, and so I was aware of what was going on with us personally, but just seeing the scale of that is kind of definitely disheartening, but incredibly important to know. And Phoenix, they said that they forgot about the US/allied forces upholding the anti-queer laws after winning. That was also something that, for a post I did recently on our TikTok, I relearned after forgetting from reading so many other different things. And it is truly, truly like breathtaking to realize the scale of suffering from queer people who were suffering during the Holocaust. Maggie saying what they found scary was the same license that was used to help could have been used by the Nazis to identify who to target. Jake, we've been talking about this recently. Do you want to elaborate on some of how queer people were targeted by the Nazi government?
Yeah, and I just, thanks to Maggie for bringing that up, because our team has talked about this a lot, how sometimes tools or processes that are meant to be progressive or provide protection for the queer community could also then be, if they fall into the wrong hands, used to harm the community. So, for example, when the Nazis ransacked the Institute for Sexual Science that issued those trans certificates, they burned everything that didn't fit, that they considered to be un-German. But you know what they kept? The patient files, right, with the names and the addresses of the patients who went to the Institute for Sexual Science. And so suddenly, they had essentially their own phone book of people and their addresses, where they lived, who they were, who their associates were, that then they used to be able to launch their campaign of persecution. And so, that is something that we really have to keep in mind today, that sometimes, especially as we're dealing with data and AI, about what kind of information is gathered about us on social media, on the web, because if that falls into the wrong hands, could easily be used to do damage. So thanks for raising that question.
All right, and we got two more in the chat. I'm going to start with Alora's, who I saw first. They were wondering about lesbians in concentration camps and whether they were sent to women's camps or not.
Absolutely. The short answer is yes. I think actually we just had a post maybe today about this, but essentially the Nazis, their misogyny drove them to believe that lesbians were not as dangerous to the state as gay men were or queer men were. And so they didn't focus as much on lesbians, but clearly any lesbian who wouldn't or couldn't pass as straight or wouldn't conform to the Nazis' ideals were arrested under a number of different laws and sent to the camps. And so we don't yet have kind of accurate statistics about how many were sent to the camps, but we do know that they were there, and they were often marked with the black triangle, which was the badge for so-called social deviants.
And we got another question from Susanna in the chat. Pardon me, by the way, if I'm mispronouncing anyone's names. She asked, can you talk about what you think American right-wing politicians actually believe they're doing, given that presumably they don't view themselves as being Nazis or even as bullies or bad people?
So I think a lot of it is kind of based in this moral supremacy, especially, once again, highlighting that I am from the South and that I grew up in that kind of environment and seeing how our politicians talked about it. A lot of this is this idea of it's a perpetuation of white saviorism. A lot of it is, I want to save myself from damnation in hell, therefore I need to try and save you. And so it's kind of this long-winded perpetuation of like, my righteousness means that I have to make sure that you are following this righteousness as well. But at the same time, there are many Republicans, as we know, that have been masquerading under this false facade, and who have been, who are queer themselves and who are subscribing still to this same narrative. And a lot of this is also about self-preservation, but in a very damaging way, obviously. And so it's not necessarily that they align themselves as being Nazis or bullies or bad people. It's that they fully are acting in a way that subscribes to self-interest. And I think a lot of that also comes off of the back of just the nature of being an American here, and a lot of the ideology that we've been instilled with from a very young age about, individualism and, like capitalistic kind of succession and how we kind of view wealth and all of this. So it kind of like all dog piles into this really large thing of like, I want to preserve myself going forward, and I want to see the pearly white gates. And apparently the pearly white gates means that I have to condemn everyone else who does not subscribe to the same beliefs or to the same lifestyles as I do. And therefore, by doing that, I'm doing the right thing. But obviously, I can't speak on behalf of all Republicans and conservatives, just because that is a very large spectrum in and of itself. But there is just a lot of different ways that kind of comes forward and how that plays into the narrative of what they perpetuate going forward.
We got 2 more questions in the chat. We're kind of running on time. Do y'all who are answering the questions mind if we run through these last 2 and that's it? All right, cool. So, almost lost them. We'll continue with Susanna's questions, because they asked a follow-up asking if you could go into the wealth aspect of it a little more, of what you were just talking about.
Yeah, for sure. So it's not explicitly a religious thing. I'm sorry that I implied that. But it's definitely, it comes from a wide range of things. As I said before, there are conservatives of all different spectrums and backgrounds and beliefs and experiences, and they all have kind of their own reasoning as to why they do what they do. But a lot of the conservative platform does come from a very religious kind of background that is perpetuated throughout the kind of larger ideology that's being spread. And so there, of course, are their own dissenters and people that speak differently. But in large part, especially when you're looking at Project 2025, there is a lot of Christian nationalist kind of rhetoric that is being spread. And that's kind of where the foundation comes from.
All right, and we got one question here from Cormac, who asked, were there specific obstacles following the end of the Holocaust to queer victims from telling their story when compared to non-queer victims? The continuation of 75 post-war had me wondering.
The short answer to that is absolutely. There were literally decades, almost a century of obstacle after obstacle after obstacle of trying to keep queer people from sharing their stories, sharing their experiences, and that included everything from just being able to talk to each other, talk to family members, also to not being allowed to construct memorials to the Nazi queer victims, and the Nazi queer victims were kept out of compensation and reparation payments by the German government all the way until 2002. And by that point, all of the gay survivors, the queer survivors, had either passed away or had spent their life, being told that they were not really a victim and that they should essentially shut up and quit whining about what the Nazis did to them. And so no queer survivors came forward. So to this day, not a single penny of official reparations have been paid to the Nazis' LGBTQ victims.
Okay, I know I said that was going to be our last question, but I just got DM'd one that I think is a really good and really important question. What's the best way to open up dialogue with people not in the LGBTQ community about the importance of this upcoming vote?
I think a lot of this is basic human empathy. I think that especially in a very polarized time, as we are seeing in the chat, there is a lot of stuff going on in the wider sphere where people are like, it's about left or right. It's about Democrat or Republican. And in the end, I think it's just talking about what your values are and how you care for others. Because in the end, voting is not just a measure of speaking on your own personal beliefs. It's also a measure of community care. And what are you advocating for other people besides just yourself? And so I really think that one thing where, especially I've tried to talk to people that are from my hometown who are maybe voting a different way than me, is basically saying, like, what do we have in common? How are we raised similarly? Why do we care about each other as people, regardless of our politics? How can we find that common bridge and see, like, you care about certain things and you are this kind of person that I know you to be. Why does your voting reflect a certain way, or why are you not voting at all? Let's have that conversation. Let's open those doors and make sure that we can just humanize each other, because I think a lot of times as well, when we're talking about voting, it's kind of this facade of just like, you put on a red hat, you put on a blue hat, you call it a day. And we're like, we are voting, and that's just what we are. We are the facade of our vote and the ballot that we put forward through the machine or to the person that are looking, the person that's looking over our ballot. But once again, this is about humanizing each other and making sure that we're seeing each other as people and recognizing the depth and the dynamic and the wide array of backgrounds that we all come from. And just once again, making each other seen as people is so important, and recognizing that we are so different yet so alike in so many ways, and just getting people out there and saying, like, I know that you come from your experiences, I come from mine. Go vote and go talk to people that you care about and who they are, and learn about who they are as people and how you can vote to protect yourself, but also vote to protect them.
I absolutely retweet everything Joe just said. But I want to also add that you can also mention to folks that extremists never just stop with targeting one group. And this history shows us that extremists, yes, they, as they were going after queer people, they were going after Jews. They were going after reproductive rights. All of this is intertwined. And so it's like, even if you don't care about me as a queer person and my LGBTQ rights, you should also be looking out for yourself, because if we let Project 2025 and these other extremists back into the White House, it's not going to stop there. It is going to affect group after group after group. And so where empathy might fail, try to talk to folks' own self-preservation.
As an addition to that point, that I heard this week something that was really fascinating. Someone, I don't want to say who this person was, but it was on the conservative side of ideology. They were talking about Catholicism as something that should be pushed back against. So even within, if you're starting to see that manifest, and that's something that happened in, I believe it was the 70s, where prior to the 70s, that was Catholicism was considered taboo.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, thank you everyone for having such spirited and lively conversation with us. These are hard topics, and it's not always easy to get in front of a bunch of people you might not know and kind of just have these difficult conversations. So thank you all so much for coming out, and again, for all of your really smart and well thought out questions. I definitely wouldn't have been able to come up with such smart questions in a limited window. So kudos to y'all for that. Some minor housekeeping notes, as Jake mentioned in the chat, and we mentioned a few times, we are recording this event for folks who couldn't attend or folks who couldn't get down everything they wanted to. It's going to be available on PTL Project's YouTube channel. If you're not following us, go ahead and give us a follow, and you'll get notified when we publish it. Be sure to follow both of our organizations on social media and explore our websites. You'll find a ton of helpful resources. And as we log off, we wanted to leave you with this note. The Holocaust didn't start with gas chambers. It started with words and stereotypes that went unchecked. Politicians turned these words into policies and enshrined in laws that slowly stripped away people's right for nearly 10 years before the mass murders began. Tonight's event has shown us how important it is for the LGBTQ+ community to actively fight for and defend our rights. the history of the pink triangle shows us what happens if we don't. So again, thank you all for coming out, and I hope everyone has a great night.